Beneath the sands of modern Iraq rests a library of clay tablets, older than the Bible, older than the pyramids, older than any written record ever discovered. The Sumerians, humanity's first civilization, left us thousands of these tablets, and in their strange cuneiform script, they recorded something extraordinary. The story of beings called the Anunnaki, who according to them created humanity itself. But here is what troubles researchers the most. The Sumerians also wrote about moments in human history that were deliberately erased from our collective memory. This event was so important, so transformative, that the Anunnaki themselves decided we should never remember it. Tonight, we travel into forgotten time to recover what was taken from us. In the middle of the 19th century, European archaeologists began excavating the ancient mounds of Mesopotamia, the land situated between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is today modern Iraq. And what they found there would challenge everything scholars thought they knew about the origins of human civilization. Beneath layers of sand and forgotten centuries, they unearthed the remains of cities so ancient that even the old Babylonians and Assyrians considered them relics of a distant past. And in these cities, they found something extraordinary. They found hundreds of thousands of clay tablets covered in strange wedge-shaped marks that would come to be known as cuneiform, the oldest form of writing ever discovered. As translators slowly decoded these tablets over the following decades, the picture of a people called the Sumerians emerged. And this picture presented what academics would come to call the Sumerian problem, a mystery that has never been adequately solved. You see, civilizations normally develop in a gradual manner over thousands of years, passing from simple hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural settlements, to villages, to towns, and finally to cities, with all the complex institutions that urban life demands. And the Sumerians seem to have completely skipped these developmental phases, appearing in the archaeological record around 4500 BCE, with their sophisticated culture already entirely formed, possessing writing and mathematics, and astronomy, and architecture, and law, and literature, as if these things had simply been handed to them ready-made. Henry Rawlinson, one of the first to decipher cuneiform, noticed this anomaly, as did later scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer, who devoted his life to translating Sumerian texts, and who never ceased to marvel at how this civilization seemed to spring from nowhere, leaving no trace of the slow developmental progression that characterizes every other ancient culture we have studied. The great cities of Sumer, places with names like Eridu and Ur and Uruk and Nippur and Lagash, did not develop organically from small settlements, but appeared as if they had been planned from the very beginning, with massive temple complexes called ziggurats rising in their centers, administrative buildings surrounding them, and residential areas stretching outward in organized patterns that suggest a central planning of a kind not seen again until much later in human history. In Nippur alone, archaeologists discovered a library containing more than 30,000 tablets, administrative records, and literary texts, and astronomical observations, and medical treatises, and legal documents, all written with a precision and sophistication that seemed impossible for what should have been one of humanity's very first civilizations. The University of Pennsylvania excavations at Nippur in the late 1800s and early 1900s revealed room after room filled with these tablets, many still waiting to be translated over a century later. And similar discoveries at Ur and Eridu added tens of thousands more to the collection. Vast archives of human knowledge dating from the very dawn of written history. What makes these tablets so remarkable is not just their age, but their state of preservation. Because while papyrus crumbles and parchment decays, and even inscriptions on stone fade over the millennia, clay tablets, when baked intentionally or accidentally by the fires that destroyed the cities housing them, become nearly indestructible ceramic archives that can survive for thousands of years, with their contents perfectly legible. And so the gift of the Sumerians was preserved for us, not in spite of the catastrophes that struck their civilization, but because of them. The very fires that ended their world baked their words for eternity. Today, these tablets are scattered in museums and universities across the globe. At the British Museum and the Louvre and the University of Pennsylvania, and in dozens of other institutions. And scholars estimate that only a fraction has been entirely translated, perhaps 10 or 20%, which means the vast majority of what the Sumerians wanted to tell us remains unread, waiting in climate-controlled storage rooms for future generations of scholars to decode them. What we have translated reveals a society of remarkable sophistication, for these were not primitive people scratching simple marks into clay, but a civilization capable of complex thought, meticulous record-keeping, and advanced calculations. Their administrative records show us a society with specialized professions, international trade, complex taxation systems, and detailed property laws. The kind of bureaucratic infrastructure we associate with modern nations, not ancient city-states. Their mathematical tablets reveal a base 60 numerical system that we still use today every time we divide an hour into 60 minutes, or a minute into 60 seconds, or a circle into 360 degrees. A whole system that allowed them to perform calculations of surprising precision. Their astronomical archives contain observations of planetary movements and stellar positions that should have required centuries of careful observation to compile. Yet they seemed to possess this knowledge from the very beginning of their civilization, as if they had inherited it rather than discovered it. Their medical texts describe surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic methods that would not be equaled until the Greek and Roman periods, thousands of years later. And their literary texts include the oldest known stories in human history, tales of creation and floods, and heroic journeys that would later appear in a modified form in the scriptures of every major religion. The Epic of Gilgamesh, found on these tablets, tells the story of a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. A story recorded in Sumer more than 1,000 years before the biblical account of Noah. And the similarities between the two accounts are too striking to be a coincidence, suggesting either a common source or a direct transmission from the older Sumerian version to the later Hebrew version. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, which draws heavily on earlier Sumerian sources, describes the formation of the heavens and the earth, and the creation of humanity, in terms that find echoes in the opening chapters of Genesis. And Atrahasis, perhaps the most important text for our purpose tonight, describes in detail how and why humanity was created, and what nearly destroyed us all. But here we encounter a problem that has troubled scholars ever since these tablets were first translated. The problem of how to read texts that make no distinction between what we would call history and what we would call mythology. When the Sumerians recorded their astronomical observations, they did so with the same meticulous attention to detail and the same factual tone they used when recording the activities of their gods. And when they compiled their king list, documenting the rulers of their cities in chronological order, they included, alongside historical kings whose existence archaeology has confirmed, other kings whose lengths of reign were measured not in decades, but in tens of thousands of years. The Sumerian king list, one of the most fascinating documents to survive the ancient world, begins with a phrase that has haunted researchers since its first translation. When kingship lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. It then lists the kings who ruled in that primordial time. Kings with names like Alulim, who ruled for 28,800 years, and Alaungar, who ruled for 36,000 years. Impossible numbers that must surely be mythological. Yet they are recorded in the same format and with the same apparent seriousness as the later kings whose historical existence we can verify. After these early impossible reigns, the king list notes that the flood swept over the earth, and after the flood, kingship descended from heaven once again, this time with reign lengths that become progressively more credible, shrinking from thousands of years to hundreds, finally reaching the decades we would expect of human rulers. Scholars have debated endlessly over what to make of this document, whether the lengths of the early reigns are purely symbolic, or represent a different counting system, or record a truth that we simply cannot comprehend with our modern assumptions about human life expectancy, and no consensus has ever been reached. The mystery remains as deep today as it was when the tablet was first translated. What we can say is that the Sumerians themselves seem to have believed they were recording history, not inventing mythology, because they made no distinction between these categories, treating the activities of their gods with the same documentary seriousness they brought to recording grain shipments, legal disputes, and astronomical observations. When they wrote about the beings they called the Anunnaki, they did not write about them as we might write about fairy tales or folklore, but as we might write about powerful foreign rulers who had once governed our land, documenting their conflicts and their councils and their decisions with the specificity of diplomatic records, naming specific individuals and specific places and specific actions taken at specific times. The Anunnaki were not some vague spiritual presence, but distinct personalities with names and portfolios and relationships and disagreements. A ruling council of beings who, according to the Sumerians, came from elsewhere, from somewhere beyond the sky, and who had shaped human civilization from its very beginnings. The word Anunnaki itself offers a clue to how the Sumerians understood these beings, for it can be translated as those of royal blood, or the princely offspring, but also in some interpretations as those who from heaven to earth came, suggesting beings of celestial origin who descended to our world for their own purposes. They were not worshipped as distant cosmic forces, but treated as immediate presences who had once walked among the first humans, who had taught them the arts of civilization, who had built the first cities and established the first temples and set the patterns that human society would follow forever. And according to the texts, according to these oldest archives of human memory, the Anunnaki did something else as well, something we will explore as our journey tonight continues. For the tablets tell us that these beings not only created human civilization, but also shaped human consciousness itself, deciding what we would remember and what we would forget. What knowledge would be passed down from generation to generation? And what knowledge would be hidden in the darkness of our collective amnesia? The Sumerians documented everything, their laws and their trades, and their astronomical observations, and their medical procedures, and their literary traditions. And with that same meticulous attention to detail, they documented their creators, beings from beyond the sky, beings who made humanity for a specific purpose, beings called the Anunnaki. And now we come to the beings themselves, these Anunnaki, whose name echoes across thousands of clay tablets, whose stories were recorded by the Sumerians with the same careful attention they gave to grain inventories and legal contracts. And to understand what they might have removed from human memory, we must first understand who they were, what they wanted, and why they came to this small blue world spinning in the vastness of space. The Sumerian texts describe a hierarchy among these beings, a structure of authority that reflects in some ways the royal courts that the Sumerians themselves would later establish. And at the very top of this cosmic order sat Anu, whose name simply means sky or heaven, the father figure who ruled from a distant celestial realm and who rarely, if ever, set foot on earth, preferring instead to govern through his children and his appointed representatives, receiving reports and issuing decrees from his throne among the stars. Beneath Anu in this divine hierarchy were two brothers whose relationship would shape the destiny of humanity itself. The first of these was Enlil, whose name translates roughly to Lord of Command or Lord of the Air. And Enlil served as the chief administrator of the Earth mission. He was the one who maintained order, enforced the rules, and made the difficult decisions that governance required. And the texts consistently depict him as stern, focused on protocol, concerned with maintaining the boundaries between the divine and the earthly, between the Anunnaki and the clay creatures they would create. The second brother was Enki, Lord of the Earth, Lord of the sweet waters. And where Enlil was rigid, Enki was creative. Where Enlil was distant, Enki was curious. Where Enlil saw problems, Enki saw puzzles waiting to be solved. And the texts describe Enki as a scientist and an inventor, a being of immense knowledge, who took pleasure in understanding how things worked and how they could be made to work differently. And it was Enki who would become the defender of humanity, our protector, and in many ways, our secret father. Beneath these great powers existed a council of divine beings, the 50 great gods and the 7 gods who decree. And the Sumerian texts describe meetings where matters of cosmic importance were debated and decided, votes organized, arguments heard, compromises reached. And this council structure appears again and again in the stories, suggesting that even beings of such power operated within a system of shared governance rather than absolute individual rule. And what were these beings actually like, according to the ancient scribes who claimed to record their nature? Here the texts offer details that might surprise those expecting purely ethereal or spiritual entities. For the Anunnaki, as they are described, actually needed food and drink. They grew tired and needed rest. They experienced pleasure and pain. They argued and they reconciled. They loved and they grieved. They made mistakes and sometimes regretted them. In short, they possessed what we might call personalities, temperaments, individual characteristics that distinguished one from another. Just as human individuals differ from one another, the Sumerians described technologies in the only terms available to them, speaking of flying vehicles called Shem or Mu that could cross the sky, of weapons that could level mountains, and boil seas, of devices that allowed communication across vast distances, of instruments that could manipulate the very building blocks of life. And while we cannot know exactly what the Sumerians were attempting to describe, their constant inclusion of such details suggests they were recording what they believed they had seen or what they had been told by those who had seen it, and not that they were inventing fantastical flourishes to embellish simple myths. And now we come to a question that pulses beneath all these ancient accounts like a heartbeat under the skin. Why were they here? What purpose brought these beings across cosmic distances to this particular world? And the texts offer an answer that is both surprisingly specific and deeply unsettling. They came for gold. The tablets describe a mining operation on a planetary scale, a mission to extract gold from the earth and transport it back to their home world. And although the precise reason for needing this gold varies across different textual interpretations, ranging from atmospheric engineering to biological necessities, the common thread is that Earth represented a resource colony, a place of extraction rather than inherent value. But mining is work, and work requires workers. And here the texts describe a problem that would lead directly to the creation of humanity. For the Anunnaki who worked in the mines grew weary. They complained. They protested against the endless toil, and finally their frustration reached the point of rebellion. The workers refusing to continue the grueling labor of extraction. This labor crisis provoked a council meeting that would change everything. A gathering where the fate of an entire species would be decided before that species even existed. The solution came from Enki, the clever Enki, the inventive Enki, who proposed creating a new being to bear the burden of the work, a creature that would combine the intelligence necessary for labor with the obedience required for service. And the texts describe in remarkable detail the process by which this creation was attempted and finally achieved. A mixing of divine essence with earthly clay. A blending of Anunnaki blood with the genetic material of creatures already existing on Earth. Working alongside Enki was Ninmah, the great mother goddess, also known as Ninhursag or Ninti, whose name, Lady of the Rib, offers an intriguing echo to later creation accounts. And Ninmah served as what we might call today a genetic engineer, her skilled hands shaping the new creature, her knowledge guiding the delicate process of combining disparate biological elements into something viable, something that could live, work, and reproduce. The texts describe failed attempts, creatures that could not hold water, that could not walk properly, that could not reproduce, experiments that went wrong before the formula was perfected. And finally, success. The creation of the Lulu Amelu, the primitive worker, the being who would take up the tools and descend into the mines and free the Anunnaki from their burden of labor. And this being, according to these ancient tablets, was us, humanity itself, designed for a purpose we were never meant to remember. Consider what this account implies concerning the relationship between humanity and these beings in those remote epochs. A relationship of creator and created, of master and servant, of those who command and those who obey. And yet the texts also suggest that this simple hierarchy became complicated over time, for the new creatures proved more capable than expected, more curious, more willful, more beautiful in their own way. And some among the Anunnaki began to feel something like affection for their creation, while others looked upon them with contempt or fear. Enki in particular seemed to view humanity with a kind of parental pride that went beyond the simple satisfaction of a successful experiment. and the texts show him repeatedly defending human interests, sharing knowledge that others wish to keep hidden, protecting humans from destruction when other Anunnaki had voted for their extinction. And this division between those who valued humanity and those who saw us only as tools would create tensions that echo through thousands of years of historical accounts. The Anunnaki gave humanity the gifts of civilization, teaching the arts of agriculture and animal husbandry, the science of astronomy and mathematics, the art of writing and law. And the Sumerians attributed every advancement, every scrap of knowledge that distinguished their society from savage existence to these divine teachers who had walked among them in ancient times. But knowledge given can also be knowledge withheld, and the texts hint at boundaries, at guarded secrets, at information deemed too dangerous or too powerful for the human mind. And here we approach the central mystery of our exploration tonight. For if the Anunnaki controlled the knowledge that humanity received, what knowledge did they decide humanity must never possess? The concept of dangerous knowledge appears repeatedly in these accounts. The tree whose fruit must not be eaten, the secret name that grants power, the forbidden chamber that must never be entered, and always this suggestion that human curiosity pushing against these boundaries represented a threat to the established order, a disruption of the careful relationship between the divine and the earthly. The texts even describe what we might call precedents of memory manipulation, moments when human consciousness was deliberately limited, when perception was altered, when the full truth of a situation was hidden behind a veil of forgetting. And these scattered references across the tablets suggest that the 7 great erasures we are about to explore were not anomalies, but rather the most significant examples of a practice the Anunnaki employed throughout their relationship with humanity. And so we arrive at the heart of our journey tonight. For the Anunnaki, according to these ancient texts, made 7 decisions to alter human memory. 7 events they determined we should not remember. Some of these events occurred before humanity existed in its current form. Some happened to our most distant ancestors, and others might explain the strange gaps in our own collective memory. The lingering feeling that something important has been forgotten, that we once knew things we no longer know, that crucial chapters are missing from the story we tell ourselves about our own origins. The first erased event takes us back to the very beginning, before the mines were dug, before the council met, to the moment when our species was still just an idea in Enki's mind. And what was taken from us there was perhaps the most fundamental knowledge of all, the true nature of our own creation. And now we arrive at the core of our journey tonight. The 7 events that, according to these ancient Sumerian texts, were deliberately removed from the collective memory of humanity. Moments of such profound importance that the Anunnaki themselves determined we must never remember them. And as we explore each of these erased memories together, let yourself sink deeper into this mystery, letting the words carry you back across thousands and thousands of years to a time when the world was younger and the gods still walked among us. The first erased event concerns the most fundamental question any human being can ask. The question of where we come from and how we came to exist. And according to the Sumerian texts, particularly the ancient account known as Atrahasis, our origin was not the slow process of natural evolution, nor the instantaneous miracle of divine creation as later traditions would describe it, but rather something much more deliberate and much stranger. An act of engineering carried out by beings who needed workers and possessed the knowledge to create them. The tablets tell us that the Anunnaki gods had come to Earth on a mission, a great labor that required them to dig canals and mine the depths of the earth. And for countless years, the lesser gods, called the Igigi, performed this grueling work, until finally they could take it no more, and rose up in rebellion against their superiors, refusing to continue the endless toil they had been assigned. It was in the aftermath of this divine rebellion that Enki, the god of wisdom and sweet waters, proposed a solution that would change everything, suggesting to the assembly of gods that he create a new being to bear the burden of the work in place of the Igigi, a primitive worker called the Lulu, who would free the gods from their labor forever. The tablets describe with remarkable detail what happened next. How the goddess Ninmah, who was skilled in the arts of creation and medicine, took clay from the earth and mixed it with the blood and essence of a god who had been sacrificed for this purpose. How she shaped this mixture in special molds and spoke the words of power over them. How the early attempts produced beings that were malformed or unable to function properly, blind or paralyzed, or unable to control their bodies. Each failure teaching her something new, until finally she achieved success. And the first true humans emerged from the process, capable of understanding commands and performing the work they were designed for. What the texts seem to describe, when read with modern eyes, sounds remarkably like a process of genetic manipulation. The combination of existing genetic material from an earthly creature, symbolized by the clay, with the genetic material of the Anunnaki themselves, symbolized by the divine blood, to create a hybrid being that possessed the intelligence to follow instructions and the physical capacity to perform labor, but who was not advanced enough to challenge its creators. And whether we interpret this literally or metaphorically, the Sumerians clearly believed that humanity was shaped with a purpose and an intention by beings who had specific needs that we were created to fulfill. According to the texts, this memory was the first to be erased from human consciousness, and we might understand why such a memory would be considered dangerous by those who created us. For what happens to a species that learns it was designed as a labor class? That its very existence relied not on love or cosmic necessity, but on the practical need for a workforce. Such knowledge might lead humanity to question its purpose, to seek out its creators and demand explanations, or perhaps to reject the work for which it was designed. And so the memory was pulled from us, like a veil drawn over the mind, leaving us to wonder about our origins without ever being quite able to grasp the truth we once knew by instinct. Even today, we feel the echo of this erased memory in our persistent questions about human origins, in the strange gap that exists in our evolutionary record, in our inexplicable need to search the stars for evidence of other beings, and in the deep unease that sometimes stirs within us when we contemplate whether we might be alone in the universe. As if a part of us remembers that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, that the beings who made us might still be watching from somewhere beyond our sight. If our very creation was an act of engineering, then perhaps it is not surprising that the second erased memory concerns what we were meant to replace. For the tablets speak of beings who existed on Earth before humanity took its first steps, beings whose memory has faded almost entirely from our collective consciousness. The second erased event reaches even further back in time, to an era before the Lulu walked the earth, when other intelligent creatures tended the gardens of the gods and served in the temples that rose above the fertile plains. And the Sumerian texts contain tantalizing references to these early inhabitants, speaking in fragments and whispers, as if even the ancient scribes were uncertain of the details of these forgotten predecessors. Some passages describe earlier attempts at creating a worker species, beings that were stronger than humans or lived longer, but who possessed a fatal flaw that rendered them unsuitable for the gods' design, who were perhaps too aggressive, or too independent, or too limited in their capacity to learn and adapt. And these failed models were apparently abandoned or destroyed, their physical traces buried deep beneath the sediments of time. Other texts speak of the Igigi themselves, the younger gods who served the great Anunnaki and who labored on Earth before humanity existed, suggesting there was an entire civilization of divine or semi-divine beings operating on our planet for millennia before the first human drew breath, building structures and extracting resources and shaping the Earth according to plans we can no longer comprehend. Most intriguing, perhaps, are the scattered references to giants, which appear not only in Sumerian texts, but in the mythologies of cultures all over the world. Beings of enormous stature who once walked the Earth, and whose bones, some researchers speculate, might still lie hidden in places we have not thought to look or have been conditioned to ignore. And these giants are sometimes described as the offspring of gods and humans, suggesting a period of interbreeding between the Anunnaki and early humanity that produced a hybrid race of extraordinary physical power. The memory of these predecessors was erased, the texts suggest, because knowledge of their existence would raise uncomfortable questions about the cycles of creation and destruction that have occurred on this planet, prompting humanity to wonder if we too are merely a temporary experiment destined to be replaced when a better model is developed. And such thoughts would breed anxiety and despair rather than the contented labor the gods desired from their new creation. We see echoes of this erased memory in the legends of giants that persist across eras, and that traditional science struggles to explain. In our fascination with the possibility of advanced prehistoric civilizations, and in the stubborn feeling that the history we have been taught is somehow incomplete, as if crucial chapters had been torn from the book of time and hidden where we cannot find them. These forgotten predecessors were not the last to be erased from our memory. And the third event concerns something humanity once possessed and lost, a gift so precious that its removal fundamentally altered what it means to be human. The third erased event touches upon one of the most profound mysteries embedded in the ancient texts, the incredible lifespans recorded for the first humans and the kings who reigned before a great catastrophe swept the earth. Numbers so vast that modern scholars have largely dismissed them as symbolic or mistranslated. Yet the Sumerians recorded them with the same meticulous precision they applied to their astronomical observations and their commercial transactions. The Sumerian king list, one of the most remarkable documents to survive the ancient world, records the reigns of rulers who governed before the flood in terms that seem impossible according to our current understanding, declaring that the first king, Alulim, ruled for 28,800 years in the city of Eridu, and after him, Alalngar ruled for 36,000 years, and so on through a list of 8 kings whose combined reigns totaled hundreds of thousands of years before the flood swept over the earth and kingship was carried away to heaven. After the flood, the king list shows a dramatic and steady reduction in the lengths of reign, falling first to thousands of years, then to hundreds, and finally approaching the normal human lifespan we know today. As if something fundamental had changed in the human constitution. a certain capacity for longevity that had been deliberately diminished. The texts suggest an explanation for these extraordinary lifespans, speaking of the food of the gods and the water of life that could prolong existence well beyond natural limits, and of a tree whose fruit granted immortality, or something close to it. Gifts that had been given to early humanity, but were later withdrawn when the gods determined that such longevity made humans too dangerous, too capable of accumulating a wisdom and a power that might eventually rival that of their creators. We find remarkable parallels in the Hebrew scriptures, where the early patriarchs similarly lived for hundreds of years, Methuselah reaching 969 years, and Adam himself living for 930 years. And these lifespans also decreased steadily after the flood, until reaching the 70 years we now consider the natural human allotment, suggesting a shared memory of a lost longevity that both cultures inherited from a common source. The memory of our original life expectancy was erased, the texts imply, because it would cause unbearable grief to know what we once possessed and can never recover, and because the knowledge of how our lives were shortened might inspire attempts to restore our lost years, efforts the gods apparently wished to prevent. Today we feel the echo of this memory in our universal fear of death and our relentless search for ways to prolong human life. In the myths of the fountain of youth and elixirs of immortality that appear in every culture, in our intuitive sense that death is somehow unnatural and wrong, and in the strange sorrow we feel for a loss we cannot name, as if somewhere deep inside us we remember what it was like to look forward to centuries of life rather than mere decades. If our lives were shortened, then perhaps we were also meant to forget what could be accomplished in a longer life. And the fourth erased memory concerns the civilization that flourished when humans still lived for millennia, a golden age whose glories surpassed anything we have achieved since. The fourth erased event takes us into a world that existed before the Great Flood, a civilization so advanced and so harmonious that its memory, had it survived, would make everything we have built since seem primitive by comparison. A world where the gods walked openly among humans and shared their knowledge freely, where cities gleamed with technology we can barely imagine, and where humanity lived in a state of connection and understanding that we have never been able to regain. The Sumerian texts speak of this antediluvian world in terms of both wonder and warning, describing cities that existed before the flood, such as Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, and Shurupak, each governed by gods who taught humanity the arts of civilization. And although these city names would be reused after the flood for new settlements built on the ruins, the original cities possessed a character and a capacity that the later versions could only dimly reflect. In those ancient times, according to the texts, the boundaries between gods and humans were much more permeable than they would later become. The Anunnaki residing in great temple complexes called ziggurats, where humans could approach them and receive instruction. And this direct contact produced a civilization of remarkable sophistication. A civilization that understood the movements of the heavens, the secrets of medicine and agriculture, the mysteries of writing and mathematics, and perhaps even technologies that we would recognize as advanced by our own standards. The texts hint that the humanity of this era developed spiritual capacities that have since atrophied, abilities to perceive and communicate with beings beyond ordinary sight, to heal through the manipulation of subtle energies, and to access knowledge through means other than the physical senses. Capacities that the gods had initially granted, but later decided were too dangerous for a species they had created to serve them. Yet this civilization ultimately failed to satisfy its creators. And the texts record that Enlil, the chief administrator of the Anunnaki on Earth, grew increasingly displeased with humanity, disturbed by our noise, our proliferation, and perhaps by the very advancement the gods themselves had fostered, until finally he determined that this experiment must end and the slate must be wiped clean. The memory of the civilization before the flood was erased, the texts suggest, because remembering our past heights would make our current state unbearable, inspiring either despair at what was lost or a dangerous ambition to reclaim what was taken from us. And either of these reactions would interfere with the quiet development the gods had planned for the remnant of humanity that survived. We feel the echo of this memory in the persistent legends of lost golden ages that appear in every culture, in the stories of Atlantis and Lemuria and Eden, in our feeling that human history is not a story of constant progress, but of greatness, decline, and rebirth, and in the archaeological mysteries that suggest sophisticated knowledge in a distant past that cannot be explained by conventional historical models. This civilization was destroyed in what the Sumerians called the Great Catastrophe. But the memory of the flood itself was not entirely erased. Only humanity's role in provoking it and the debates among the gods over whether we deserved to survive. The fifth erased event concerns the true nature of the Great Flood, an event remembered in cultures all over the world, but stripped of its most crucial details. The knowledge that it was not a natural disaster, but a deliberate act of destruction, decided by a council of beings who held our fate in their hands. The Sumerian accounts of the flood, preserved in texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh and Atrahasis, provide a stunningly different narrative from the sanitized versions we inherited, revealing that the flood was the result of a divine decision to exterminate humanity, a genocide planned and executed by the very beings who had created us, and that we survived only because one God chose to defy the will of the assembly and save a remnant of our species. According to these texts, Enlil brought the matter before the council of the Anunnaki, complaining that the noise of humanity disturbed his rest, and that we had multiplied beyond what was useful, arguing that we should be destroyed, and the experiment brought to an end. And the assembled gods, perhaps weary of the complications humanity had introduced into their affairs, agreed to his proposal, and swore an oath to keep the decision a secret from the doomed species. But Enki, who had designed humanity and felt a creator's affection for his creation, could not bear to see his work entirely destroyed. And so he found a way to circumvent his oath without technically breaking it, going not directly to a human, but to a reed wall, and speaking as if to himself of the coming catastrophe, knowing that a wise man named Utnapishtim was sleeping on the other side of the wall and would hear every word. Utnapishtim, warned by this apparent accident, built a great vessel according to the specifications provided by Enki, sealed it with pitch, and loaded it with his family, skilled craftsmen, and the seed of all living things, so that when the waters rose and covered the earth, destroying the cities and the civilization humanity had built, a remnant survived to begin again in a world washed clean of its ancient glory. When the flood receded and Enlil discovered that humanity had survived, he was furious at the betrayal. But Enki argued convincingly that a complete extinction would have been a waste. And ultimately, Enlil resigned himself to the continuation of our species, though on different terms than before, with reduced lifespans and limited capacities that would forever prevent us from reaching the heights we had previously attained. The true cause of the flood was erased from human memory, the texts suggest, because the knowledge that the gods had nearly destroyed us and could do so again at will would make trust and worship impossible, breeding fear and resentment rather than the grateful obedience the gods desired. And so the flood was recast in human memory as a punishment for sin rather than an act of annoyance, a moral lesson rather than an administrative decision. We feel the echo of this memory in the flood myths that appear in virtually every culture in the world, in the lingering feeling that we once did something to deserve punishment, in our complex relationship with the divine that mixes love with fear, and in the strange gratitude we feel toward forces we cannot name for allowing us to continue to exist, as if a part of us remembers just how close we came to total extinction. Humanity survived, but emerged into a changed world. And the sixth erased memory concerns what happened immediately after the waters receded, the moment when human communication was forever altered. The sixth erased event occurred in the generations that followed the flood, when the survivors and their descendants had once again multiplied and spread across the earth. And when humanity, perhaps vaguely remembering what had been lost, attempted to rebuild and to reach once more toward the heavens from which their creators had come, an effort that would provoke another intervention in human affairs, an intervention that would fragment our species in ways that persist to this day. The texts tell us that in those early days after the catastrophe, all of humanity spoke a single language, a unified tongue that allowed perfect communication among all peoples, fostering cooperation and coordination on a scale that would never again be possible. And with this linguistic unity came a dangerous potential, the capacity to work together toward goals the gods had not sanctioned. Humanity, according to traditions preserved in multiple cultures, undertook a grand construction project, a tower or structure that would reach the heavens, perhaps attempting to create a means to access the realm of the gods, or to demonstrate capacities the Anunnaki believed were no longer possible for our diminished species. And this active ambition alarmed those watching from above. The Sumerian texts describe what happened next with remarkable bluntness, stating that Enki, the Lord of Wisdom, changed the speech in the mouths of mankind, transforming what had been a single language into many languages, so that those who had worked together in perfect understanding suddenly found themselves unable to comprehend one another, their words becoming gibberish, their collaborative efforts collapsing into confusion and frustration. With the confusion of languages came the dispersion of peoples, as groups who could communicate with each other separated from groups they could no longer understand, migrating to different regions and ultimately developing into distinct cultures and civilizations, each with its own language and its own customs and its own gods. The original unity broken into fragments that would never entirely reunite. The texts suggest this was not a punishment, but a preventative measure designed to ensure that humanity could never again coordinate effectively enough to challenge the plans of the Anunnaki. And with our languages divided, we were entrusted to different gods who would oversee different territories, creating the system of competing pantheons and nations that has characterized human history ever since. The memory of our original linguistic unity was erased, the texts suggest, because to remember it would be to remember our ancient capacity for cooperation and achievement, inspiring attempts to restore what was taken and to rebuild the unity the gods had deliberately destroyed. Efforts that might eventually succeed if we clearly understood what we were trying to reclaim. We feel the echo of this memory in the story of the Tower of Babel, preserved in later traditions, in the persistent human dream of universal communication and global unity in our efforts to create common languages and translation technologies, and in the strange sense of recognition we sometimes feel when encountering people from vastly different cultures. As if beneath our superficial differences, we share something fundamental that was never completely erased. With the division of languages and the dispersion of peoples, the stage was set for the seventh and final erased memory, perhaps the most significant of all, concerning the departure of the gods themselves and their promises of return. The seventh and final erased event brings us to the end of an era and the beginning of another. The moment when the Anunnaki, who had created, guided, punished, and preserved humanity, finally withdrew from direct involvement in our affairs, retreating from the earth they had colonized and leaving behind only echoes and promises that would become the foundation of human religion for thousands of years to come. The Sumerian king list documents this transition with its characteristic precision, recording that kingship descended from heaven at the beginning of civilization and was held by the gods themselves, or their immediate representatives. But after the flood and the subsequent reorganization of human affairs, kingship passed increasingly to human rulers who governed in the name of the gods rather than alongside them. And the divine presence, which had once been tangible and immediate, gradually faded to become something more distant and symbolic. The texts suggest the withdrawal was gradual rather than sudden, the gods reducing their visibility and direct intervention over many generations, perhaps returning to where they came from, perhaps simply retreating to places on earth where humanity could not follow, leaving behind the temples and traditions that would keep their memory alive even as their actual presence faded from human experience. Before their departure, according to scattered references in various texts, the gods made promises to their human subjects, speaking of cycles that would complete and epochs that would end, hinting that when certain conditions were met or certain periods of time had passed, they would return to Earth and resume their direct involvement in human affairs. And these promises would echo through the ages in the form of messianic expectations and apocalyptic prophecies that persist in virtually every human culture. The specific details of the departure and the promises were erased from human memory, the texts suggest, because knowing precisely when the gods would return and what they expected to find would create an unnatural development, humanity merely waiting rather than growing. And because the gods perhaps wished to see what we would become on our own, without the certainty of their surveillance to constrain our choices. We feel the echo of this memory in the universal human sense of waiting for something we cannot name, in the religious expectations of divine return, present in every major tradition, in our lingering feeling of having been left alone but not abandoned, watched from afar by powers we can sense but can no longer see, and in the strange sorrow that sometimes rises for a loss we cannot remember, the departure of those we once knew and served and loved. These are the 7 events that the ancient Sumerian texts suggest were deliberately removed from human memory: our engineered origin, our forgotten predecessors, our stolen longevity, our lost civilization, our near extinction, our shattered unity, and the departure of those who made us. These wounds in the fabric of human consciousness that still ache even if we have forgotten how they were inflicted. These are 7 faults in our collective history that leave us perpetually searching for something we cannot quite identify. As we rest now in the knowledge of these erased memories, allow yourself to feel not despair, but wonder. For the very existence of these texts suggests that the erasure was never total, that somewhere deep in the human mind, perhaps encoded in ways we do not yet understand, the whole truth is still waiting to be recovered. And perhaps that recovery has already begun. And so we pause now in our journey through these ancient memories to consider something deeper, something that connects these 7 erased events like threads woven through a single tapestry. When we look at what was removed from human memory, a pattern emerges from the shadows. And this pattern tells us something profound about the nature of forgetting itself. Each of the 7 events we have explored tonight shares a common thread, because each of them concerns the fundamental nature of what humanity truly is. The memory of our engineered origins would change how we perceive ourselves as a species. The knowledge of those who preceded us would alter our understanding of our place in the long history of the earth. The truth about our original life expectancy would transform our relationship with time and mortality. The glory of the antediluvian civilization would remind us of the heights we once reached. The reality of the flood as a deliberate act would reshape our understanding of divine intent. The memory of our original unified language would reconnect us to a wholeness we have lost. And the details of the departure and the promise would give us something to wait for, consciously, something to prepare for, something to hope for with clarity, rather than with a vague nostalgia. Each of these erased memories, when you truly think about it, points toward the same unsettling and yet somehow magnificent truth, that humanity is perhaps much more than we currently believe ourselves to be. Each forgotten event suggests that we possess potential we do not recognize, origins we do not admit, and a destiny we do not remember choosing. And that is perhaps precisely why these memories were taken. Because beings who fully understood their own nature, their own origins, their own capacities, such beings would be much harder to guide, much harder to control, much harder to make work in the gardens and minds of the gods. But how do you erase the memory of an entire species? And how do you ensure that the forgetting persists across thousands and thousands of years? The Sumerian texts hint at several methods that worked in concert through the ages. The first and most fundamental may have been genetic, woven into the very fabric of our created bodies. If the Anunnaki truly designed humanity by mixing their essence with earthly clay, then perhaps they also built limitations into our design. Perhaps they created minds capable of forgetting, minds that would not retain certain categories of memory across generations, minds with built-in barriers against accessing deeper knowledge. The second method was simpler and more brutal: the destruction of physical records. The Great Flood itself, whether natural or deliberate, would have swept away almost all traces of the antediluvian world. Every library, every monument, every written record from the time before, what the waters did not wash away, time and conquest would eventually claim, as later civilizations built their temples on the ruins of the previous ones. As parchments crumbled and tablets were buried beneath the desert sands. The third method was perhaps the most elegant: the deliberate transformation of memory into myth. When a true event is retold as a legend, when history becomes a fairy tale, when the specific becomes symbolic, The memory remains in a certain form, but loses its power to inform and transform. The gods knew that humans would always tell stories. Rather than fight this tendency, they shaped it, guiding the narratives so that the truth would hide in plain sight. Dismissed as primitive imagination, as metaphor, as mere mythology. And the fourth method required no divine intervention at all, because it is simply in the nature of collective memory to fade when it is not actively maintained. Without written records, without monuments, without rituals of remembrance, even the most significant events blur and dissolve over generations. What the grandparents lived becomes stories for the grandchildren, and what those grandchildren tell their own descendants becomes legend. And what begins as a legend ultimately becomes nothing more than a strange feeling, a half-remembered dream upon waking, a sense that something important has been lost. But this brings us to a question that has haunted philosophers and mystics across all ages. Why would beings of such power and such knowledge choose to make us forget? If the Anunnaki were truly our creators, if they truly guided us through the first millennia of our existence, why would they hide our own history from us? Perhaps, and we can only speculate here in the gentle dark of contemplation, perhaps some knowledge truly is dangerous. Perhaps understanding our engineered origins would have broken something essential in the primitive human psyche, would have rendered us unable to function, unable to find meaning in our labors, unable to love, to build, and to dream. Perhaps knowing the full truth about the flood and the divine debate would have poisoned our relationship with the cosmos, would have filled us with fear rather than wonder, and resentment rather than gratitude. Perhaps the memory of our ancient longevity would have made our shortened lives unbearable, would have turned every human heart toward bitterness at what was taken away. Perhaps in a strange way, the forgetting was a gift. Perhaps we needed the freedom that comes from ignorance, the space to develop our own identity outside the shadow of our creators. The opportunity to become something more than servants remembering their servitude. Perhaps the Anunnaki, or at least some of them, understood that for humanity to truly grow, we had to forget our childhood. We had to enter a world where we believed ourselves alone, to be the protagonists of our own story, rather than simply playing supporting roles in someone else's epic. And yet, even if we accept this possibility of protective forgetting, we cannot ignore the cost. For there is a lingering ache in the human soul, a feeling that something essential has been lost, a feeling that we have forgotten something terribly important. Every culture on Earth tells stories of a golden age, of an earlier time, when things were better, when gods walked among us, when we lived in harmony with each other and with nature. Every spiritual tradition speaks of a fall, of a separation, of a forgetting that must be overcome through practice, seeking, and grace. We search and search for our origins, building telescopes to look at the stars, digging into the earth to find bones and artifacts, sequencing our own genomes, looking for clues. We feel, even those of us who consider ourselves entirely rational and modern, that we are being watched, that something larger is happening, that our lives have meaning beyond what we can see and measure. And in our dreams, especially in our dreams, images come to us that we cannot explain. Memories of places we have never been, knowledge of things we never learned, encounters with beings we cannot name. Perhaps these dreams are just the random firings of sleeping neurons, but perhaps they are fragments of what was taken away, echoes of erased events, briefly resurfacing in the only state of consciousness where the barriers thin and the forgetting loosens its grip. This, then, is the grand paradox we are left to contemplate. If the memories were truly erased, if the forgetting was truly complete, then how is it that we are speaking of these things tonight? How did the clay tablets survive? How did the scribes of Sumer know what to write? How did these stories persist through 5,000 years of floods, fires, conquests, and neglect? Perhaps the erasure was never total. Perhaps it was never meant to be. Perhaps there was always that which was allowed to be remembered, or perhaps there were keepers of the memory, priests and scribes, and guardians of secret knowledge, passing the truth from generation to generation in the form of coded myths and sacred texts, waiting for the day when humanity would be ready to hear, waiting for the day when the forgetting would begin to lift. And perhaps that day is coming. Perhaps it is already here. For you are listening to these words now, and something within you recognizes them. Something deeper than rational thought. Something that has waited a very long time, and yet we remember it, not perfectly, not completely, but in fragments, in stories, in dreams. The text survived, the questions persisted. And perhaps that was always the plan, that when we were ready, the memories would begin to return. The final section of our journey tonight examines where these memories might be resurfacing now. What signs suggest that the veil of forgetting is beginning to lift, and what it might mean for humanity if we are indeed approaching an age of remembering. And so we arrive at the present moment, at the world that you and I inhabit tonight. And perhaps it is worth pausing here to notice something remarkable. Something the ancient scribes of Sumer could never have imagined when they pressed their reed styluses into wet clay thousands of years ago. We now live in an era where the very technologies described in those distant texts have begun to emerge from the realm of mythology into the laboratories and research centers of our modern world. Today's scientists routinely modify the genetic code of living beings, splicing genes from one species to another, creating organisms that have never existed in nature. And while we call this progress and innovation, the Sumerians would have instantly recognized it as the work of those who shape life itself. The process by which Ninmah is said to have mixed the essence of the gods with the clay of the earth finds its echo in the gleaming facilities where researchers today alter the very code of human existence. And beyond our own planet, serious scientists at respected institutions now openly discuss the theory of panspermia, the idea that life on Earth may have been seeded from elsewhere in the cosmos, that the building blocks of biology drifted in from the stars, or were perhaps deliberately placed here by unknown intelligences. What was once dismissed as fringe speculation now appears in peer-reviewed journals and is debated at academic conferences, as if the collective human mind were slowly circling back to questions the Sumerians answered 5 millennia ago. Then there is the enduring mystery of consciousness itself, that strange light of awareness looking through your eyes at this very moment, the one phenomenon that science has utterly failed to explain. And some researchers have begun to wonder if consciousness might be fundamental to the universe rather than just a byproduct of brain chemistry. If mind itself could have existed before matter, which is precisely what the ancient texts seem to suggest when they speak of divine beings who thought the world into existence. And when we examine the fossil record with honest eyes, we find gaps and discontinuities in human history that have never been adequately explained. Sudden leaps in brain size and capacity, the mysterious appearance of symbolic thought and art, as if something intervened at key moments to accelerate our development beyond what gradual evolution could achieve. But perhaps even more striking than these scientific parallels is the way these ancient themes have persisted in human culture across all continents and all eras, refusing to fade despite thousands of years of forgetting. The flood that swept over the earth in the Sumerian account appears with remarkable consistency in the traditions of peoples who had no contact with Mesopotamia, from the mountains of South America to the islands of the Pacific, from the frozen north to the heart of Africa, as if the memory of this great catastrophe were carved so deeply into the human psyche that even deliberate erasure could not remove it completely. In our time, the ancient astronaut hypothesis has captivated the imaginations of millions, appearing in films, television programs, and books that sell by the tens of millions of copies. And though scholars might dismiss this fascination as mere entertainment, one has to wonder why such ideas resonate so powerfully, if there is not a deeper chord being struck. A half-remembered truth trying to break the surface of the collective dream. Almost every culture on Earth retains some notion of a golden age, a time before time, when humans lived in harmony with divine beings, when knowledge flowed freely, and when death had not yet taken its cold grip on mortal life. And this universal sense of paradise lost cannot be explained by mere coincidence, or by the borrowing of stories from one tradition to another. And everywhere you look in religions and mythologies, and even in secular hopes for the future, you find the narrative of return, the promise that those who left will come back, that the teachers will return to their students, that the cycle will complete, and that what was broken will be made whole. Something seems to be stirring in our time, a resurgence of interest in these ancient mysteries that goes beyond casual curiosity. More people are studying ancient texts today than at any point in human history. Translations are being made available. Tablets that have sat in museum basements for a century are finally being deciphered. And with every new discovery, the picture becomes more detailed and more strange. Archaeological finds continue to push back the timeline of human civilization, revealing sophisticated sites far older than conventional history allowed, suggesting that the story we have been told about our own past is incomplete at best. There is a feeling in the air, hard to name but widely shared, that we are standing on the edge of a great revelation, that the veils are thinning, and that what was hidden is preparing to be known. And that brings us to the most profound question of all, a question you might hold gently as you drift towards sleep tonight. What would it mean if we truly remembered? If the 7 erased events were to return to human consciousness, and we finally knew where we came from and why we are here, such knowledge would change everything about how we understand ourselves, our place in the cosmos, our relationship with the beings who may have shaped us, our responsibility to each other and to the world we inhabit. Perhaps we would feel less alone in the universe, knowing that others have walked this path before us, and that our existence is not just an accident of chemistry, but a deliberate act of creation. Perhaps we would feel a new sense of purpose, understanding that we were made for something, even if we had forgotten what it was. Or perhaps, and this too is worth considering, there is wisdom in not knowing, in allowing the mystery to remain a mystery, in trusting that whatever was hidden for a reason, and that the truth will emerge when we are ready to receive it. You do not need to decide tonight which path is right. whether to seek out the forgotten memories or to rest peacefully in ignorance. Both are valid responses to the great mystery. Both honor the journey we have taken together through these ancient stories and these distant times. The important thing is that you have opened yourself to wonder, that you have allowed your mind to travel beyond the boundaries of the everyday into the vast spaces where questions matter more than answers, and the seeking itself becomes a kind of homecoming. And so we come to the end of our journey through the mists of forgotten time, having traveled together through those moments that, according to the ancient texts, were deliberately removed from the treasury of human memory. We began with the first erased event, the true origin of humanity itself. That startling claim found in Atrahasis and other tablets that we did not simply evolve, but that we were engineered, shaped from the blending of earthly clay and divine essence in the laboratories of beings who needed workers for their great enterprise. We then drifted further back to uncover the second forgotten truth, that before us there were others. Earlier attempts, different beings who walked this earth and tended the gardens of the gods before vanishing into the silence that preceded our arrival. The third memory taken from us concerned our original lifespan. Those impossible numbers in the king lists suggesting that early humans lived for thousands upon thousands of years before something changed, before our time was cut short and we forgot we had ever known such a long existence. From there, we explored the fourth erased event, the magnificent civilization that flourished before the Great Flood. A world where gods walked openly among humans and knowledge flowed freely. A golden age now buried beneath the waters and the forgetting. The fifth memory concerned the flood itself, not as a natural disaster, but as a deliberate decision. The heated debates within the Anunnaki Council over whether humanity should be allowed to survive, and the secret defiance of Enki, who whispered warnings to the one who would build the ark. We then encountered the sixth forgotten truth, the severing of languages. That moment when unified humanity was scattered and our single tongue was shattered into countless fragments. A division designed to prevent us from ever again working together with the power we once possessed. And finally, the seventh erased memory, perhaps the most haunting of all, the departure of those beings, their withdrawal from direct involvement in human affairs, and the promises they made to return when the great cycle completes. 7 memories. 7 events that, according to these clay tablets inscribed 5,000 years ago, we were never meant to recall. And yet, here we are, speaking of them, wondering about them, as if somewhere deep within us the memories lingered in spite of it all. What are we to make of such claims? The Sumerians did not write their accounts as mythology in the sense we understand it today. To them, these were not stories meant to explain natural phenomena or to teach moral lessons through fiction. They recorded these events with the exact same meticulous care they gave to administrative records, to trade agreements, to astronomical observations. In their minds, they were preserving history. Whether this history reflects literal events, symbolic truths, or something in between that our modern categories cannot quite grasp, remains an open question. And perhaps it should remain open. There is a certain wisdom in not forcing an answer upon mysteries that have endured for millennia. The ancient sages themselves understood that some knowledge must be approached with humility, that the mind that grasps too tightly often crushes the very thing it seeks to hold. The Sumerians knew this. They built their temples as bridges between worlds, recognizing that humans stand in a middle place, between the earth and the stars, between knowing and ignorance, between remembering and forgetting. Perhaps that is where we are meant to rest tonight. In this middle place, holding these mysteries gently, rather than demanding they surrender their secrets. Not all questions require an answer to fulfill their purpose. Sometimes the questioning itself is the gift, the wonder that opens us to possibilities we might never have considered, the contemplation that softens the rigid edges of what we think we know. The great teachers of every tradition have recognized that there is a knowing beyond knowledge, an understanding that comes not from grasping, but from letting go, not from waking effort, but from the quiet receptivity of rest. And so, as we prepare to let these thoughts settle like sediment in still water, let us turn one last time back to that ancient land between the rivers. Imagine the sun setting over the ruins of Ur, over the crumbling ziggurats and the mounds that hide libraries of unread tablets. The sky deepens from gold to heavy purple, and one by one the stars appear. The exact same stars the Sumerian priests observed and charted. The same stars that look down upon the events we have described tonight, if indeed those events took place. In museums scattered across the world, the clay tablets rest in climate-controlled cases, their cuneiform impressions holding stories that most visitors walk past without a second glance. But the stories wait. They have already waited for 5,000 years. They can wait longer. And perhaps tonight, as you drift toward sleep, a fragment of what we have discussed will settle into a place beyond ordinary memory, joining the great reservoir of human wonder that connects us across the ages. The Sumerians believed the gods would return. Many later traditions harbor similar hopes or similar fears. But whether anyone returns or not, whether this is all literal history or an elaborate metaphor, one thing seems certain. We are a species that asks questions about its origins. We are beings who feel, however vaguely, that something important has been forgotten. And in that very questioning, in that persistent feeling that there is more to our story than we currently know, perhaps we prove that no memory can ever be entirely erased. The tablets survived the fires that baked and hardened them. The stories survived the floods that buried them. The questions survive in us, passed down through countless generations, who never read cuneiform, but who still look up at the night sky and wonder. And so we close our eyes tonight, holding these mysteries gently, like clay tablets in careful hands. The Sumerians wrote their stories down, and somehow, against all odds, those stories made their way to us. Perhaps they were meant to. Perhaps in a distant future, when we have grown wise enough, the full memory will return. But for now, it is enough to wonder. It is enough to have traveled, however briefly, into the deep past. The stars that look down on ancient Sumer are looking down on you right now. The same stars. The same questions. And somewhere in the space between waking and sleep, perhaps you remember more than you know. Rest now. Let the mysteries keep themselves. Tomorrow the questions will still be there, patient as clay, ancient as starlight, waiting for whenever you wish to return to them.